The classical virtue of humility versus modern barbarism. A glaring manifestation of the barbarism of our age is to be found in the dominant discourse that pretends that men are either violent thugs or effeminate fairies, as if fragility were a virtue. Upon close scrutiny, we find that the fragility heralded by our technocratic institutions, not least of them our universities, is a sham imitation of classical Christian humility, humilitas. Let us consider briefly what St. Thomas Aquinas has to say about humility. In his Summa Theologiae, the Doctor Angelicus writes, "A double virtue is needed. One, indeed, that tempers and refrains spirit, lest it tend to the highest things in an immoderate way, and this pertains to the virtue of humility. The other, verily, that strengthens spirit against despair, and drives that very spirit to the pursuit of great things in accordance with right reason, and this is magnanimity." Having vilely abandoned classical great things, magna, replacing them with worldly power and the idealistic, most notably Machiavellian Kantian mask thereof, modern man has lost sight of classical humility, mistaken it for fragility, seen as a virtue autonomous of our natural ends in God. While humility reflects the discrepancy between our finite mind and God's own perfection, modern fragility bespeaks our misery in an essentially godless world, a misery that is supposed to be redeemed in its expression, promoted by a universally flattering machine as proof that we do not need to rise heroically to the highest things, or things in God, but submit to the machine as ultimate guarantor of freedom. Such is the upshot of the unfolding of a modern project that found a most notable diversion, or Trojan horse, in the work of Dostoevsky, whose dichotomy between the man of action and the psychopath, the oversensitive, resentful weakling, failed to yield to an otherwise promised catharsis in divine intervention. Classical virtue lingers at best in shadows, symbols, manners of speech, promises alienated from St. Thomas's right reason, which is natural reason properly understood, natural reason in itself, and thus, too, in God. Yet Dostoevsky had the decency of at least nominally placing virtue in God, whereas today virtue is sought unabashedly in the absence of God and virtue alike. To be virtuous is to pretend that there is no real, no classical virtue, that the heroic path to God the Father is but a chimera, and that true virtue is found in the anti-patriarchal triumph of subjective fragility, of the effeminate, promoted by our technocratic regime on a planetary scale. Dante Alighieri helps us understand what Aquinas is speaking of. In his comedy, Dante's humility is manifest in his embrace of the other way, altra via, pointed to by Virgil, a way that does not depart from classical ascents to the divine, but that exposes them as poetically mediated. The other way is indeed that of other poets, gli altri poeti, of other things, altre cose, which imply a poetic understanding of the upright way, diritta via, the way of right reason, ratio recta, as per Aquinas himself. Dante's humility is found in a reflective turn, volgere, allowing the poet to discover the divine at the roots of the human, and so of human folly. God himself calls us to what for the cynical is but folly. Hence Dante's provisional confession from Inferno 2, I fear that the coming might be foolish. Temo che la venuta non sia folle. In advancing, going, as he puts it, by returning, or coming, the poet is heroic in the element of reflection. He does not renounce Aquinas's great things, magna, but pursues them through moderation in the sense that he seeks them in the middle of the path of our life, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, not as ends demanding that we abandon common sense and civil duty, but as ends sustaining classical pietas, and so patriarchal honor, never to be mistaken as a liberal imposition, but cherished unhesitatingly as the proper character of the honest, Cicero's honestum, of he who consecrates his whole life to the living truth as our greatest friend.